I never believed in ghosts. Growing up in the Midwest, I was raised on science, on logic, and the idea that there was always a rational explanation for everything. But everything changed when I took a job as a fire lookout in the remote mountains of Wyoming. I had heard about the job through a friend who had worked in the Forest Service, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape the noise of the city. The position was simple: sit in a tower and keep watch for any signs of wildfires. It was solitary work, no distractions, just the wind in the trees and the distant calls of birds. Or so I thought. My first day on the job was a calm one. I was stationed in a small wooden lookout tower perched on top of a steep ridge. The view was breathtaking, the endless stretch of pine trees below me, the snow-capped mountains in the distance. It felt like a peaceful haven away from the chaos of daily life. The silence was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and it was both soothing and eerie at the same time. The first few days passed without incident. I spent my time scanning the horizon, noting any changes in the landscape, and reading books to pass the long hours. But as the sun set each evening, an unsettling feeling would wash over me. It was as if something was watching me from the darkening forest below. I would shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but the feeling persisted. Then came the first night that I would never forget. It was late, well past midnight, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the mountains. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the air felt thick with tension. I had just settled into bed after scanning the forest one last time for any signs of smoke when I heard a strange sound. It wasn't the usual rustle of the wind or the calls of nocturnal animals. This was something else. A tapping sound, soft at first, like fingers drumming against the side of the tower. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but the sound grew louder. I could feel my heart start to race as the tapping continued. It was rhythmic, deliberate. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly got out of bed, walking toward the window to see what was making the noise. There was nothing. The forest below was dark and silent, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably the wind making strange noises. But then, the tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from beneath the tower. I knew there was nothing down there, no animals, no people. The tower was isolated, miles from the nearest road. But the tapping kept going, and it seemed to be moving, like something was circling the base of the tower. I couldn't help myself. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the small window, scanning the ground down below. My pulse quickened as I saw movement, just a flicker of something in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still in the darkness. I couldn't see any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. My mind raced and panic began to set in. I tried to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching me. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the only sound I could hear was my own rapid breathing. Then a voice, a whisper, barely audible, drifted up from below the tower. "You can't hide up there." My blood ran cold. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to be hearing things. There was no one out there, right? The voice came again, closer this time. "You can't hide from me." I ran to the door of the tower and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I had no way of getting down. The nearest help was hours away. All I could do was wait, but I couldn't stop my mind from racing with all the possible scenarios. For what felt like hours, I sat in the dark, barely breathing, listening for any signs of movement. The moon had moved across the sky and the wind had died down, leaving only the eerie silence of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting for me. At some point, exhaustion took over and I must have fallen asleep in the chair. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, it was still dark. The moon had disappeared and a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest in a dense, ghostly shroud. I looked out the window again, but this time, the forest seemed different. The trees loomed like shadows, and the fog made everything feel distorted. My mind felt foggy too, like I couldn't quite trust my own thoughts. I stood up, feeling dizzy, and stumbled toward the door to check outside. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with the smell. a rancid, decaying stench that made me gag. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the smell of something dead, something that had been rotting for days. I grabbed the radio and tried to contact the ranger station, but the static was all I could hear. There was no signal. For hours, I stayed in that tower, unable to make sense of what was happening. The tapping came again, but this time, it was different. It was like a scratching, as if something was trying to climb up the side of the tower. The scraping sound grew louder, and I could hear the heavy breathing of something close by, and then the whispering voice returned. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a guttural growl filled with malice and rage. "You shouldn't have come here." My breath caught in my throat as I felt the temperature drop, a coldness seeping into the bones of the tower. I turned toward the window, and my eyes went wide with terror. A figure stood in the fog, just outside the reach of the tower's light. It was tall, hunched over, with long, twisted limbs. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes were glowing, a sickly yellow that burned through the mist like lanterns. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and fell to the floor. The thing outside the tower seemed to sense my fear. It moved closer, its slow, deliberate steps dragging against the earth. Each step sent a wave of dread through me. "Why are you here?" the voice asked, now louder, more demanding. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, trying to find some way out of this nightmare. But I knew there was no escape. The thing outside the tower let out a low, hollow laugh, and the fog seemed to close in tighter around me. I realized then that I was no longer alone. There were other figures in the mist. More of them. All watching, all waiting. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the tower, too afraid to move, too afraid to make a sound. When dawn finally broke, the fog lifted, and the figures were gone. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever had been out there, it wasn't finished with me yet. I left the tower that day, never looking back. I never went back to work for the Forest Service. They say the job is dangerous because of the fires, but I learned that sometimes the real danger lies in the things we can't explain. I don't know if it was a ghost or something else. I don't know if the thing I saw that night was real or just my mind breaking under the pressure of isolation, but I'll never forget those glowing eyes, and I'll never forget the voice that whispered to me from the fog. I never believed in ghosts, but I do now. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
I don't know what I was thinking when I agreed to take the job as a fire lookout. I guess the solitude and the peace of nature seemed like an ideal escape from the noise of the world. I was just out of college, lost, unsure of what my next steps were, and this job offered me a chance to clear my head. The fire tower was isolated, perched high above the forest, with a breathtaking view that stretched for miles in every direction. But the first night, I felt something shift in me. The air was too quiet, the shadows too thick. It was a routine job. You'd stay up there, scan the horizon every few hours, keeping an eye out for smoke or fire. During the day, you'd pass the time by reading, hiking, or just soaking in the vast wilderness. The nearest town was a couple of hours away, and the tower was the only building for miles. At first, I found that comforting. No distractions, no one to bother me. But it didn't take long before I started to notice strange things happening. Little things, at first, things I could brush off as my imagination playing tricks on me. On the second night, I was sitting on the small cot in the corner of the lookout cabin, staring out of the glass windows at the dense forest below. The wind was howling, rattling the tower, but it was a comforting sound. The isolation felt peaceful, at least until the rustling started. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, pushing the trees, but then I heard it more distinctly. Footsteps. The sound of someone walking, shuffling through the underbrush below. I went to the window, looking out, but all I saw was darkness. No movement. No one was there. I chalked it up to paranoia. I mean, who else would be out there? There were no roads, no trails leading up to the tower. The nearest ranger station was miles away. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation making me more jumpy than usual. The next day, I went on my usual hike to stretch my legs, and I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. The forest, though beautiful, seemed too still, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area around the lookout. I noticed strange, twisted shapes in the trees, branches bent in unnatural ways like something or someone had been moving through them. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I tried to shake it off. I was alone out here. Nothing could harm me. But as night began to fall again, the feeling only intensified. It wasn't just the quiet, it was the presence. I felt like someone or something was standing just outside the tower, watching me. I tried to keep myself busy, reading a book, eating, anything to distract myself from the gnawing sense of unease that grew stronger with each passing hour. That night, the footsteps returned. I froze in place, the sound of movement below the tower unmistakable. I couldn't see anything from the window, but I could hear it. There was a low, dragging sound like someone dragging their feet through the underbrush. My heart started to race, my breath shallow. I grabbed the radio, but there was no answer from the station. There hadn't been for the past few days. My only connection to the outside world was dead silence. I stepped away from the window and backed into the center of the room, my mind racing. What should I do? What if someone was out there? A lost hiker? A ranger in distress? My instincts told me to call for help, but the radio was useless. I waited, hoping the noise would stop, but it didn't. Instead, the footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, a knock, knock, knock. I froze. I couldn't breathe. The knock came again, this time on the cabin's metal door. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was out there at the base of the tower. The wind had died down, and now there was nothing but silence and the faint creak of the tower swaying in the wind. I didn't know what to do. I thought about going down the stairs to check, but I was paralyzed with fear. The knock came again, followed by an eerie, raspy voice calling my name. Help, help me, please, it's cold up here. It sounded like a man, but it didn't sound human. The voice was unnatural, strained, as though it had been scraped out of the throat of something inhuman. It chilled me to the bone. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I had no idea what to do. I sat there, trembling, praying that whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. The knocking continued, more urgent this time. Then, suddenly, the door slammed open with a force that shook the tower. I could hear the hinges screeching, but I didn't dare move. I stayed there in the center of the room, holding my breath. There was no one there. The door was wide open, the night air whipping through it, but nothing else had moved. No one was there. That's when I saw it, a figure, just a shadow, standing on the other side of the window. It was tall, thin, and impossibly still. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on the very air around me. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then the figure raised a hand, its long, bony fingers tapping against the window as though it was beckoning me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything except stare, frozen in terror. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, until finally the figure spoke again. Come outside, just for a minute. Just come, just step out. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was a darkness in it that made every fiber of my being scream to run, to get as far away as possible. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. My eyes kept flicking from the figure to the door, then back again. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming, hallucinating, or if something was truly standing outside. I glanced back at the stairs, considering whether I could escape, but the thought of stepping away from the window, away from the figure, felt impossible. Suddenly, there was a bang from the base of the tower. I jumped, spinning around, but there was nothing. The tower creaked, groaned, and for a moment I thought it might collapse under the weight of whatever was haunting me. I heard another voice, louder this time, more frantic, calling for help. But the voice wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, distorted, a sound that I would never forget, as if it came from the very pit of hell. I backed into the corner of the room, my legs too weak to stand. The figure was gone. The door had slammed shut again. The noise outside had stopped. The silence was deafening. I couldn't breathe. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, staring at the door, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. I don't know when I fell asleep or if I even did, but when I woke up the next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. The sun was shining, the birds were singing. The only trace of the night before was the open door and the faintest trace of something wet on the floor, something that looked like blood, but I couldn't be sure. I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I'm not sure what happened up there in that tower. Maybe it was the isolation that drove me to madness. Maybe it was something far worse. I never went back, and I've never been able to explain the things I saw or the feeling that I was being watched, even now, years later. But there's something I've never told anyone, something I haven't been able to shake. I went to the ranger station after leaving the tower to tell them about the strange happenings. They didn't seem surprised. In fact, they seemed almost indifferent. They told me that fire lookout towers were often built on old, sacred ground where strange things had happened long before the towers were even constructed. They said they were aware of the fire lookout horror stories, that there were whispers about things that followed people home from those towers. They warned me not to talk about it too much, that it was better to forget. But I can't, and I don't think I ever will. Are you hooked on these spine-tingling stories? Subscribe to get more and never miss a scary moment.
Next story.
I remember the night I was assigned to the fire lookout. I wasn't expecting much, just a few weeks in solitude, away from everything. The summer had been hot, and they needed someone to monitor the surrounding wilderness for any signs of fire. It sounded like a simple job, alone in a tower checking the horizon for smoke. How hard could that be? The tower was high, the kind that looked like something out of an old movie. It had that vintage metal frame structure, and the small cabin at the top had just enough space for me and my gear. I didn't mind the isolation at first. The view was incredible. It felt like I was on top of the world, and the quiet was almost peaceful. The first couple of days passed with ease. I would scan the forest for fires, read, maybe nap, and eat canned food. The silence was almost a friend to me. There were no distractions, no one around to bother me. It was just me and nature. But as the days wore on, I started to feel watched. Not in the way you feel when you're in a crowded room and someone's staring at you. It was different. Like I wasn't the only one there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was always just out of sight. It started small. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A rustle in the trees below when there was no wind, a flicker of movement at the corner of my eye. I kept checking my radio, making sure everything was working, and looking out across the vast expanse of forest. But every time I looked back at the trees, they seemed to shift just a little bit more. It was subtle, but it was there. On the fourth night, things took a turn. I had been reading, trying to distract myself from the constant unease gnawing at the back of my mind. The wind had picked up, shaking the tower slightly, and the sound of branches creaking below added to the feeling of isolation. I made sure the windows were shut tight, the door locked, and checked my radio again. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Then the knocking began. It wasn't loud at first. It was soft, like someone was tapping lightly on the window. I froze, thinking it was just the wind, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks in a row. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I'd read the handbook for fire lookout personnel. There were no other people supposed to be out here. I was isolated, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. Who could be out there? I approached the window, my breath shallow. I peered through the small pane of glass, but the darkness outside was thick, swallowing everything in its path. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, but there was nothing else. No figure, no movement. Then, without warning, the radio crackled to life. "Help me." The voice was faint, distant, like someone was speaking from the other side of the world. I leaned forward, my hands trembling as I grabbed the mic. "Who's there?" I demanded. "Who is this?" But all I got in response was static. My heart raced. I glanced nervously at the door and the windows. Was someone playing a prank on me? The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. No one knew I was up here. No one except the crew at the station, and they hadn't checked in for a while. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, but the fear didn't go away. The knocking started again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I ran to the window, my mind racing. I could see nothing, not a soul in sight. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam out into the dark forest below. But there was nothing, no one. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my heart pounding against my chest. But something told me this wasn't over. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. The radio crackled again, and this time, the voice was clear. "I see you." I felt my blood run cold. I froze, unable to move. The voice was not from the station. It wasn't Tom or any of the rangers. It was something else. Something unnatural. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Static filled the air, and then the voice responded, its tone cold and menacing. "I'm right behind you." I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the door locked, the windows secured. But the weight in the air, the oppressive feeling of being watched, grew stronger. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my chair. The wind outside howled, and I could hear the trees creaking, groaning under the pressure. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the dark shapes of the trees shifting and moving, though I knew they weren't. It was like something was pushing in from the edges, wrapping itself around me, tightening with every breath I took. Then came the most horrifying sound of all, the scraping of something against metal. It started at the base of the tower, low and slow, like claws dragging along the metal supports. It was getting closer. The sound scraped up the length of the tower, each scratch a jagged, bone-chilling screech. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but the fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move. The voice came again, now a hiss full of malice. "Leave, or it'll come for you next." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't open. The door was stuck, the metal frame unyielding. I pulled harder, panic rising, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of the scraping was louder now, closer, coming from just beneath the floorboards. I screamed, rattling the door, but it wouldn't open. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of breathing, ragged and deep, right behind me. I spun around, but the room was still empty. No one was there. I realized then there was no escape. The wind howled around the tower, the trees outside shaking in a violent dance. The whispers came again, this time clearer. "You can't hide from me." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness, leaving me in complete blackness. My chest tightened as I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When I turned it on, the beam of light fell on the corner of the room. There in the shadows was a figure. It was tall, with limbs that seemed to bend and twist unnaturally, its face hidden in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the light. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. My mind screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figure moved toward me, its shape warping in the dim light, stretching and distorting. I had never been so terrified in my life. Suddenly, the door burst open with a violent crash, and I stumbled out into the storm. The wind slapped me, pushing me toward the edge of the tower. I didn't look back. I ran, my legs pumping, my heart thundering in my chest. The tower, the figure, the voice. All of it was a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then, as I reached the bottom, I stopped. There was no sign of the tower. It had vanished, leaving nothing but the darkness and the eerie silence of the forest. The voice had stopped. I never went back to that place. I don't think I ever could. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that voice, feel that presence, watching me from the shadows. Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until the fire lookout job changed everything for me. I had taken the position after a tough breakup, hoping the isolation would clear my head and let me start fresh. I'd read about the quiet beauty of the towers, the endless sky, and the promise of peace. What I didn't realize was that the tower wasn't just isolated, it was cursed, and it was waiting for me. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the last remnants of sunlight began to fade behind the mountains. The tower loomed high above, casting a long shadow across the thick forest. There was a certain eeriness to the place, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But I told myself it was just my nerves. I was new to this. The lookout cabin was small and simple, equipped with only the bare necessities: a cot, a small stove, a table, and a radio that barely worked. The fire tower itself was a wooden structure, creaking and groaning in the wind as I made my way up the steep metal stairs to the top. The view was incredible, but there was something unsettling about being so far removed from civilization. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me, setting up my gear and preparing for my first shift. There was supposed to be a forest fire watch, a routine I'd need to follow. Every couple of hours, I was to check the horizon for any sign of smoke. Simple enough. I did my rounds as instructed, scanning the endless expanse of trees, hills, and sky. But as the night wore on, the silence began to feel suffocating. By the time the sun had set, I felt the weight of solitude pressing down on me. The wind howled, rattling the metal frame of the tower, and the trees below whispered in the dark. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every so often, I'd catch the faintest sound, footsteps maybe, or something else moving through the forest. It was distant at first, and I convinced myself it was just an animal. But as the hours passed, the sound grew closer. I got up, walked to the window, and peered into the night. There was nothing. No movement, no animals. The forest was still. But that's when I saw something. It wasn't anything physical, but rather a shift in the darkness, a shadow that seemed to move against the wind, swaying from tree to tree. My stomach twisted in a knot. The footsteps returned, but this time they were unmistakable. They were right beneath the tower. Someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed the radio, but there was no response, just static. I glanced nervously at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, but it remained still. The footsteps stopped, and the silence grew oppressive. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Just when I thought the worst was over, the radio crackled to life. A voice came through, low and distorted. "Help me." It was a soft whisper, almost too faint to hear, but the words chilled me to the core. My hands shook as I pressed the mic, trying to respond, but the static swallowed my words. "Hello, is someone out there? Can you hear me?" I said, my voice trembling. The voice returned, this time clearer. "Come down. Please. You're not alone." I froze. There was no way I could be hearing this. No one else was supposed to be up here. The nearest ranger station was miles away. I glanced out the window again, my heart pounding. The figure I thought I had seen earlier was gone, but I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I stepped away from the window and moved toward the door, trying to shake the sense of dread that had settled over me. That's when the tapping started. Tap! 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 At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, more frantic, like someone was knocking at the door. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't just at the door. The knocking was on the walls, on the window, all around the cabin. The sound was deafening, and I could feel the tower shaking from the force. It was as if the very structure of the building was being attacked from the outside. I bolted to the window and yanked it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I peered into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the endless forest and the inky black sky. But the knocking didn't stop. It came from above. I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. There, perched on the highest platform of the tower, was a figure. A man, but not quite. His body was bent and twisted, as if his joints no longer worked in the way they should. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light around him. He raised a hand, tapping at the edge of the tower, and his lips parted, though no sound came from them. The wind howled again, and I felt my legs give way beneath me, dropping to my knees in sheer terror. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the figure raised its other hand and pointed directly at me. "Come outside," it whispered, its voice like gravel being scraped against metal. "It's time." The tower groaned, and I felt it shift beneath me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure on the platform grinned, though it didn't seem to have a mouth. It was more like a sickening distortion of its face, like the shadows around it had taken shape. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. The knocking had stopped, but the figure remained, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. My breath was shallow, and every part of me screamed to leave, to get away from that tower, from that presence, but I couldn't. Finally, the figure began to move. Slowly, its limbs contorted and twisted, but it wasn't walking. It was sliding down the side of the tower, its body sliding against the metal like a serpent. It reached the window in a matter of seconds, its black eyes staring into mine. I could feel its cold breath on my face, and I realized then that I wasn't looking at a man. I wasn't looking at anything human. It was something older, something that had been waiting here, in this tower, for someone like me to arrive. Something that had been watching for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know how I managed to escape, but I ran. I ran down the stairs, out the door, and into the forest. The tower loomed behind me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The woods were thick, and the night seemed to close in around me as I stumbled through the trees, trying to put as much distance between myself and that tower as I could. I never went back to the lookout tower. When I finally reached the ranger station, I tried to tell them what had happened, but no one believed me. They said the tower had been abandoned for years, that no one had been stationed there for a long time. But I know what I saw. I know what was waiting for me in that tower. And I know that there are things in the woods, things that have been there far longer than we have. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something else. Something far worse. Want more thrill and suspense? Hit subscribe now and stay haunted with our ghost stories.
Next story.
I remember the night so clearly, even though it's been years. The fire lookout tower was isolated, perched on the edge of a massive forest, and I had signed up for the job as part of my summer break. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to escape the noise of city life, but I had no idea what awaited me. Looking back, I wish I had never set foot on that tower, but I'll never forget the terror that I experienced. The first few days went smoothly. I had a radio, a map of the area, and a few old books to keep me company. The fire tower was a relic, rusted and creaky, but it gave me the sense of being on top of the world, far away from the hustle and bustle below. It was all so quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional calls of distant birds. I'd scanned the horizon, ensuring there were no signs of smoke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. On the fourth night, the air changed. The wind had picked up, and I could feel a strange chill in the air that I hadn't noticed before. The radio crackled to life, startling me. I jumped, grabbing the mic and answering the call. "Hey, it's Tom," the voice on the other end said, familiar and comforting. "Everything good up there?" "Yeah, all clear," I replied, still scanning the darkened forest below. "It's been quiet." "Good. Just keep an eye out. The storm's coming in, and we don't want any issues with the weather. Let me know if you need anything." "Will do," I said, but something about his voice made me feel uneasy. He sounded distant, distracted. I couldn't place it, but I'd never heard him like that before. The storm didn't come that night, but something else did. It started with a sound, soft at first, like a faint tapping at the door of the tower. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or maybe a bird pecking at the wood. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, tap, 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 like something or someone was knocking. I stood up slowly from my chair, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I checked the door, the lock was still in place. Nobody could be out there. No one was supposed to be here except me. It was hours away from the nearest town. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking continued, almost rhythmic now. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly made my way to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but before I could open it, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the radio crackled again. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to the table. "Hello?" I said into the mic, my voice shaky. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by a low, distorted whisper. It was so faint that I almost couldn't make it out, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "Help me." I froze. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling, but there was no response. Just more static. I was shaken. I knew it wasn't Tom, and no one else was supposed to be up here. The isolation was one of the reasons I'd taken the job. I wanted peace, but now I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some weird glitch with the radio. Maybe it was just my nerves. But the feeling of dread was creeping over me, settling into my bones. The knocking had stopped, but the eerie feeling lingered. I forced myself to sit back down, staring out the window into the blackness of the forest. I could barely make out the outline of the trees below, but the vast emptiness felt oppressive. The hours crawled by, the wind howling outside as the storm finally rolled in. I kept telling myself to relax, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was out there watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept the radio on, but it remained silent, offering no comfort. I kept my eyes glued to the horizon, watching for any signs of smoke or fire, but my mind kept wandering back to the sound from earlier. Morning finally came, but I felt no relief. I made my coffee, staring out the window at the dense forest below, the fog settling in like a shroud. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing motionless in the trees. It was barely visible, just a silhouette, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. I squinted, trying to make out details, but it vanished into the trees just as quickly as it appeared. I felt my pulse quicken as my eyes darted across the forest. There was no one there now. Maybe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The unease in my chest was growing. I radioed Tom later that morning, needing to hear another voice. When he answered, he sounded normal enough, but there was something about him that seemed off. He asked how everything was, and I told him about the figure I'd seen. "You sure it wasn't a trick of the light?" he asked, a little too casually. "I'm sure," I replied, the suspicion growing in my gut. Something wasn't right. He didn't seem concerned enough for someone who was supposed to be looking out for me. "Just keep an eye on things," Tom said. "We'll check in with you later." I wasn't reassured. I barely knew what to do with myself after that. The forest outside was oppressive, as though it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something or someone lurking just beyond the trees. That night, I thought I heard footsteps beneath the tower, soft, shuffling, and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced through the small window at the base of the tower, but I saw nothing. Nothing but the dense, swirling fog. The footsteps stopped, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The rest of the night passed in a blur of panic and confusion. I checked the doors, the windows, the stairs leading up to the tower. No sign of anyone. But when I returned to the radio to check in with Tom, something strange happened. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Tom's voice that came through. It was a whisper, faint and urgent, but unmistakable. "Don't trust him." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold as I clutched the radio. I shouted into the mic, "Who is this? Who's there?" But there was no answer, just static. That's when I knew. Tom wasn't who he said he was. I wasn't talking to the man I thought I had been all this time. There was someone else on the other end. Something that had been toying with me, whispering through the radio, and now it was closer than ever. The knocking started again. It came from the door, but this time it was louder. Faster. More frantic. I didn't move. I couldn't. The wind howled outside, and I thought I saw a shadow moving just outside the window. The trees seemed to sway unnaturally, bending as though something massive was moving among them. And then there was a voice. "I'm coming for you." I slammed the radio off, desperate to block out the sound, but it was too late. I could feel the presence outside, watching, waiting. I had to get out of there, but the storm had made the road impassable. There was no way to escape. I stayed there, paralyzed, listening to the whispers and the knocking, unable to escape the tower. The last thing I remember was the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs, slow and deliberate, before everything went black. When I woke up, the tower was empty. The storm had passed. There was no trace of anyone, no sign of the figure in the woods, and no trace of the voices. But I knew it wasn't over. The fire lookout was never meant to be a place of peace. And whatever had been out there, whatever had been calling to me, was still out there, waiting for the next lonely soul to take its place. Don't miss out on more hauntingly good stories. Subscribe now.
Next story.
I've never told anyone this, not even my closest friends, but I feel like I need to get it out before it consumes me. It's not something I can just forget. It was my first summer working as a fire lookout, a fresh start. I'd been a city boy all my life, always surrounded by noise, always busy. But when I got the call offering me the job in the remote Rockies, I saw it as my escape, the chance to get away from the world for a while, to breathe clean air and get some peace. How wrong I was. I arrived at the lookout tower early in the season. It was a wooden structure, old but sturdy, nestled high on a ridge, surrounded by miles of untouched wilderness. The view was breathtaking, a sea of pine trees stretching for as far as the eye could see, and beyond that, the towering peaks of the mountains. It felt like I was on top of the world. I loved it. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up with the sun, eat a simple breakfast, and spend my days scanning the forest for any signs of smoke or fire. Everything was calm. I'd read books, journal, and enjoy the quiet solitude. There was no one for miles. It was just me in the wilderness. But the quiet, it started to feel different after a while. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It became unsettling. The days were long, but the nights were worse. The first strange thing happened on the third night. It was just past midnight, and the wind had started to pick up, howling through the trees below. I was sitting in the corner reading when I heard a noise, a low, muffled thud. I looked up, my heart racing. I figured it was just the wind or a tree branch falling, but it sounded too close, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over to the window, shining it out into the dark. Nothing. The trees swayed in the breeze, their shadows long and eerie under the light of the moon, but there was nothing else. I laughed to myself. I was just imagining things. But then the thud came again. This time, it was louder. I quickly pulled back from the window and backed into the room. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, maybe something falling in the wind. I locked the door and tried to forget about it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. The thuds, the scratching sounds, and then whispers. Soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to block it out. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. The isolation was getting to me. The next morning, the sun was a welcome sight. It seemed to clear the fog in my mind, and the events of the night before felt distant, like a bad dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder over the next few nights. I'd hear them whenever I was alone in the tower, just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes they sounded like voices, sometimes like the wind, but always in that same eerie tone. I started checking the perimeter of the tower at night, scanning the ground below with my flashlight, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the darkness. One night, I made the mistake of stepping outside to see if I could figure out what was causing the noises. The moment I left the tower, the temperature dropped, a biting chill that made my breath freeze in the air. The moon was full, and the forest seemed to stretch out infinitely before me, silent and still. I took a few steps into the woods, but the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from every direction. They were no longer soft and distant, but clear and demanding. "Come closer," they said. "Come closer." I don't know why, but I followed the voices. I walked deeper into the forest, away from the tower. The trees closed in around me, their twisted branches creating a canopy of shadows. The fog was thicker now, swirling at my feet, but I didn't stop. The whispers were all around me, guiding me, pulling me forward. Eventually, I reached a clearing. The whispers stopped. The fog was so thick that I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. But there, in the center of the clearing, was an old stone structure, a ruin, half swallowed by the forest. It looked ancient, as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The walls were cracked, the roof caved in, and vines snaked their way up the stones. It was as if the forest had reclaimed it, as if it had always been there, waiting. I don't know why I went inside. Maybe the whispers told me to. Maybe I just felt drawn to it. But when I stepped into the ruin, something changed. The air grew colder, and the weight of the place seemed to press down on me. It was like stepping into a tomb. The walls felt alive, like they were watching me. I could feel eyes on me, unseen, yet somehow everywhere. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't asking me to come closer. They were angry, demanding. I heard one voice rise above the others, clear and sharp like a scream. "Leave now," it hissed. "You shouldn't have come." I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like something was holding me in place, something invisible, something ancient. The air thickened, and the whispers turned into cries. Cries of torment, of pain, of suffering. I could hear the sounds of footsteps, though there was no one around. The ground seemed to tremble beneath me. I finally managed to break free, stumbling back toward the tower. When I reached the clearing's edge, I looked back, and there, standing in the doorway of the ruin, was a figure. Tall, cloaked, its face hidden in shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that burned into my mind. It didn't move, but it was watching me, waiting. I didn't stop running until I was back inside the tower, where I locked the door and collapsed in a heap on the floor, gasping for breath. I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't want to. The whispers never stopped after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, they were there, calling to me. I couldn't escape them. I tried to leave the tower the next morning, but when I reached the edge of the forest, the path was gone. The trees had shifted overnight and the landscape had changed. It was like the forest had closed in around me, trapping me inside. I don't know how long I was up there. Days? Weeks? Time felt irrelevant. But the whispers followed me everywhere I went. They never stopped. They grew louder, more insistent, always calling me back to the ruin. The last time I went outside, I didn't return. I walked into the forest and the forest swallowed me whole. Sometimes I can still hear the whispers, even now. I can still feel that cold, suffocating presence in the air. I'm not sure if I'm still in the tower or if I'm trapped somewhere else. Maybe I never left. But if you ever find yourself alone in a fire lookout tower, in a place where the forest stretches on forever and the silence becomes too heavy to bear, don't listen to the whispers. They won't let you go. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
I had been warned about the fire lookout tower before I even applied for the job. It was the kind of warning that most people would shrug off. It's a little weird up there, that's all, they'd say. Nothing to be afraid of. But I wasn't one to believe in superstitions, especially after I had spent years working in isolated locations, ranches, remote cabins, places where the only company was the wind and the occasional animal. A fire lookout tower seemed like the perfect place for someone like me, used to solitude, to recharge and make a little money. So when I got the call for the position, I packed my things and drove out without a second thought. It was a beautiful place, high up on a ridge, surrounded by dense forest. The tower itself was an old wooden structure, creaky and weathered, but it still stood tall against the sky like a sentry watching over the vast wilderness. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time in the small cabin at the base of the tower, reading and making sure everything was in order. Every few hours, I'd go up to the top of the tower and scan the horizon for signs of smoke or fire. The job was simple, almost relaxing, but that sense of peace began to unravel one night, the night I'll never forget. It was just before dusk, and the air had taken on that heavy, oppressive stillness that seems to precede a storm. I was finishing up my rounds when I noticed something strange, movement in the forest. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but as I focused, I realized it wasn't any animal. There were figures, shapes moving slowly through the trees, at least 3 or 4 of them, but they weren't moving like people. They were too deliberate, too silent. I grabbed my binoculars, trying to get a better look, but the shapes were already disappearing into the shadows, vanishing into the thick underbrush. I couldn't make out any details, not even the color of their clothes, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I immediately radioed in, but the static was overwhelming. It was as if the radio waves themselves were disturbed by whatever I had just seen. "Is anyone out there?" I spoke into the mic, but the response was just more static. I decided to wait it out, hoping it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. After all, the forest was full of life, wildlife, hunters, maybe even other rangers. It wasn't entirely unheard of for people to wander near the tower, though it was rare. That night, I made my usual rounds before heading to bed. The wind had picked up, rattling the metal frame of the tower, and the trees swayed ominously. The sound of branches cracking under the pressure of the wind was almost too loud, but I forced myself to focus. I didn't feel alone, though. I felt watched, a creeping sensation that made my skin prickle. I was halfway up the tower, standing in the center of the small cabin, when I heard a knock. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door. It came from the door. No one could have climbed up here. It was too steep, and I hadn't heard any vehicles. But there it was, another knock, this time louder. I approached the door cautiously, my hand on the knob, but before I could open it, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back, suddenly unsure of what I was about to face. Then, through the thick, heavy quiet, a voice, no, a whisper, drifted in through the window. "Come outside. It's not safe inside." The words were soft, almost gentle, but the tone was wrong. Too calm, too flat. It didn't feel human. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering. What was I supposed to do? Should I open the door? Should I call for help? The radio crackled to life again, this time more clearly than ever before, but the voice on the other end was distorted. "Stay inside. Don't go out there. They are coming." The message sent a chill down my spine. Who was they? What was out there? I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made my way back up the stairs to the top of the tower. From there, I could see the entire forest stretching out before me, dark and still. But the shapes were back. They were moving again, circling the base of the tower, their figures barely visible in the dim light of the moon. I wasn't imagining it. They were real. I thought about calling for help, but the radio was useless now. I couldn't risk going down the stairs to get to the truck. Who knew what those things were? I knew deep down that if I left the tower, I wouldn't come back. The figures grew closer. They were no longer trying to hide. They were shambling, dragging their feet. Their arms stretched out in front of them like they were reaching for something, or someone. I had nowhere to run. The wind howled outside, and I could hear the sound of branches cracking, something large moving through the forest, but still, I didn't dare leave the tower. I stayed at the top, watching the figures move closer until one of them stopped directly under the tower. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring up at me. I couldn't see his face, just the outline of his body, stiff and unnatural against the moonlight. Finally, he raised a hand, pointing at the base of the tower. Then, with a low, rasping voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, he said one word. "Help." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The words didn't make sense. How could he need help? How could I help him? My body was frozen in terror, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. And then, just like that, they all started moving toward the tower, moving with purpose, their slow, deliberate steps echoing up the metal stairwell. I had no choice. I grabbed my bag, ran down the stairs as fast as I could, and bolted into the woods. The sound of footsteps following me echoed in the night. I could hear them, just behind me, getting closer. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I knew that if I did, I'd be lost to whatever was waiting for me. I made it to the road, to the truck, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the tower. I don't remember much after that. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion. The next day, I tried to return to the ranger station and explain what had happened. But when I showed up at the lookout, the tower was gone. No trace of it remained, as if it had never existed. The rangers looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I saw. I knew those figures weren't human, and I knew they were waiting for someone to come up there. Waiting for me. I don't know what it was, but I know I'll never go back to that tower. Whatever was out there, whatever I saw, it wasn't meant for me. Feeling spooky? Keep the chills coming by subscribing to our channel for more ghostly stories.
Next story.
It was the middle of July when I first took the fire lookout job, the heat of summer bearing down on me. I didn't expect it to be a dream job by any means, but I had always loved the idea of being alone in the wilderness with nothing but trees and sky for company. I didn't realize then that I was signing up for a nightmare. The tower itself was perched atop a ridge, far from any major roads or human settlement. The drive to the base of the tower was long and winding, but that just added to the allure. When I arrived, the place seemed peaceful. Too peaceful, perhaps. The fire lookout cabin was small but sturdy, with a single room at the base and a narrow staircase that led up to the observation platform. The view was breathtaking, a sea of trees stretching to the horizon, with mountains rising in the distance. The first few days were uneventful. I got into a rhythm of climbing up the tower every few hours, scanning the horizon for signs of smoke. The silence up there was almost overwhelming at times, but I found it oddly comforting. I would spend the nights inside the cabin, reading, cooking, and just enjoying the stillness. But then something started to change. It wasn't anything overt, just little things. A sound in the distance, a fleeting glimpse of movement through the trees. I told myself it was just wildlife, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But the unease began to grow. The wind would shift unexpectedly. The trees would rustle when there was no breeze. Every time I went up the tower, I'd feel a strange pressure in the air, like something or someone was watching me. One evening, I decided to take a walk down the trail that led away from the tower. It was a short walk, but as I walked, I noticed something odd. The trees were too still. There was no rustling, no chirping of birds, no buzzing of insects, just silence, an unnatural silence. As I continued walking, I spotted something up ahead, a figure standing just off the path in the shadows. I froze. It was a person, a man standing motionless between the trees, his back to me. His clothes were torn, his hair wild like he'd been out there for a long time. His skin was pale, almost ghostly. I took a cautious step forward, but something made me stop. My instincts screamed at me to turn back. "Hello?" I called out, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there, yet unmoving. I tried again. "Are you lost? Are you okay?" Still no answer. It was like he hadn't heard me at all. I took a step closer. The air felt thicker now, almost suffocating, and that's when I noticed something truly unsettling. The man's shadow wasn't right. It didn't match the angle of the setting sun. His shadow was stretching unnaturally long, like it was trying to reach out toward me. It felt wrong, like the shadow wasn't part of him at all. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, my heart racing, and ran back toward the tower, not daring to look behind me. I didn't stop until I was safely inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. I sat there, shaking, trying to rationalize what I had seen. The man had to have been a figment of my imagination. There was no other explanation. That night, the unease intensified. I kept hearing sounds outside the cabin, scratching at the door, soft whispers carried on the wind. I could hear someone moving around, but whenever I opened the door to look, there was nothing. No one. I thought maybe I was just overworked, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But then the next day, the man appeared again. This time, he was standing at the base of the tower, staring up at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. His shadow stretched out toward the tower like an omen. I froze in terror. How had he gotten there so quickly? I had just left the tower to go on my morning rounds, and yet here he was, waiting for me. I picked up the radio, hoping to reach someone, anyone, but there was nothing but static. It was as though the entire world had been cut off from me. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring until I couldn't bear it any longer. That night, I made the mistake of trying to leave the tower to investigate. Maybe I thought if I confronted him, I could make sense of this madness. But as soon as I set foot outside, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, the trees creaked, and I felt a hand grab my shoulder from behind. I spun around, but no one was there. I could hear breathing, though, ragged and slow, like it was coming from all around me. But no one was there. I rushed back into the tower, locked the door again, and for the first time I felt truly trapped. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew something was terribly wrong. The man, whatever he was, wasn't human. He was something else. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for me to come to the tower. The radio crackled to life again, and I heard a voice, distorted, static-filled whisper, "It's too late. You're already here." That's when I realized something I hadn't considered before. I wasn't just staying in a lookout tower. I was staying in a place with a history that went back much further than I had thought. There had been fire lookouts here before me, and they had all disappeared under strange, mysterious circumstances. Some said it was the isolation, others said it was just bad luck, but the truth was something much darker. The tower was cursed. I knew then that I had to leave. I had to get out of there before whatever was in those woods claimed me too. But when I tried to pack up, my body wouldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but the moment I reached for the handle, I heard knock, 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 knock. It was slow, deliberate, and chilling. Then the voice, soft but clear, came through the walls. "Don't go. You're mine now." I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked out the window. There he was again, the man standing just beyond the reach of the light, his shadow stretching toward the tower. And this time, he smiled. I don't know how I made it out of there. I don't know how I ran, but somehow I found myself in the truck, speeding away down the narrow trail, the tower shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back, and I never told anyone what happened. The rangers I spoke to dismissed it as a wild story, probably just stress from being alone too long. But I know what I saw. I know that the man in the forest was real, and whatever he wasn't human. He was something older than that, something tied to that cursed place. The fire lookout tower is still there, hidden in the mountains, waiting for the next person to take its place. And next time I'm sure it will claim someone else. Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts, not until that summer. I thought I had everything figured out, the job, the solitude, the clear air of the mountains. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong. It started innocently enough. I was assigned to a fire lookout tower in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. It was a beautiful spot, isolated with sweeping views of the forest below. The place had an old-fashioned charm to it, like stepping back in time. The tower itself was small, with just enough room for a bed, a desk, and the essentials needed for long shifts. I had always preferred being alone. I wasn't one for the noise of the city, the distractions, or the people. So when the job came up, I jumped at the opportunity. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to get away from everything. And for the first few days, it was just that. I would wake up with the sun, sit in the tower, and watch the trees below, scanning for any signs of smoke. It was a quiet, repetitive job, but it was satisfying. The silence was thick, the kind of silence you only find in places far removed from civilization. The hours would stretch out like that, each one blending into the next. There was a certain beauty in it, a kind of peace I hadn't known before. But then the dreams started. At first, they weren't much, just odd flashes of images, a shadow in the corner of my vision, a flicker of movement in the trees. Nothing solid, nothing concrete. I would wake up and shake it off. It was probably just the isolation, I told myself. But the dreams continued, each one more vivid than the last. One night, I woke up suddenly, as though something had pulled me from my sleep. The room was bathed in an unnatural coldness, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the small room, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the tower, barely visible in the dark. It was tall, its features hidden by the dim light, but I could feel its presence, cold, oppressive. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there. I blinked and the figure was gone. I sat up in bed, heart pounding in my chest. I must have imagined it, I thought. The isolation was getting to me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next few days, the dreams grew worse. I would see the figure again, not just in the corner of my room, but in the trees outside the tower, moving through the shadows just beyond my reach. Sometimes, it would be close enough that I could almost make out its features, but always just out of sight. There was something unsettling about it, something wrong. It felt like it was watching me. One afternoon, I decided to confront whatever it was. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something was truly out there. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and walked around the tower, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The air was thick and the forest was unnervingly quiet. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. Then I saw it. Just at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the shadows, the figure. It was standing still, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. The figure began to move toward me slowly, deliberately. My heart was in my throat, my legs shaking with fear. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as it drew closer. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. I stumbled back toward the tower, my mind reeling, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what to think. Was it real? Or was I just losing my grip on reality? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that something was wrong, terribly wrong. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the flashlight gripped tightly in my hand, waiting for the figure to return. The hours stretched on, each minute dragging longer than the last. But nothing happened, or so I thought. Around dawn, just as the first light of day began to break through the trees, I heard it. A sound. A soft whispering, like the wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. It was words. Low, unintelligible words that seemed to come from all directions. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and opened the door to the tower. The forest was eerily still, the fog hanging thick in the air. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. But the whispering grew louder, and it seemed to be coming from the trees, from the ground, from the very air around me. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the fog, and that's when I saw it again. The figure. It was standing in the clearing, just beyond the edge of the tower, But this time I could see its face. It wasn't human. Its features were twisted, elongated, its skin pale and cracked, like something ancient and decayed. Its eyes were dark pits, empty and hollow, but they burned with an unnatural intensity. I could hear its whispering now, clear as day, as it took a step toward me. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "This place is ours." I backed away slowly, my mind racing, my heart hammering in my chest. My legs felt like lead. I couldn't look away from its eyes, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. I took another step back and then another, until I turned and bolted for the tower. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I had seen or what it wanted. All I knew was that it was real. I didn't leave the tower after that. I stayed inside, too terrified to step foot outside. The whispers grew louder every night, sometimes sounding like voices, other times like the wind, but always the same warning. "You shouldn't have come." Days passed. I don't know how many. Time became irrelevant in that place. I would check the radio, but there was never a signal. No one knew where I was, and the figure, whatever it was, never left. It watched me, always from the shadows, always just out of reach. I don't know how I got out of there. I don't remember if I ran or if something else happened. All I know is that I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to have left that tower, and sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear the whispers. They follow me wherever I go, and I know deep down they always will. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
I still can't shake the feeling of what happened up there. You know, I never thought much about the supernatural or anything like that. But that was before I worked as a fire lookout in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was my first season, and I was eager to start. The ranger station was excited too, and they sent me to a remote lookout tower at the edge of the wilderness with nothing but miles of trees surrounding me. My job was simple: watch for smoke, report any signs of a fire, and stay put until my shift was over. Quiet, peaceful, perfect. I arrived at the lookout tower in late spring. It was an old structure, perched on a ridge with a 360-degree view of the vast forest. From up there, it looked beautiful, like something out of a dream. But there was something else too, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the place had a presence, a quiet, unshakable weight to it. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into the rhythm of the job, keeping an eye on the horizon, jotting down my observations, and staying busy with books and writing. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I was sitting at the desk watching the sunset when I heard it for the first time. A tapping. Soft at first, almost like the sound of a branch against the side of the tower. But then it grew louder. The kind of tapping you'd hear if someone were knocking at your door, but there was no door at the base of this tower. I leaned toward the window, my breath caught in my chest. The forest below was bathed in twilight, but there was no sign of movement. No animals, no people, just trees and silence. I shook my head. It must have been the wind or an animal. But then it came again. Louder this time, more insistent, as if whatever was out there wanted my attention. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it down toward the base of the tower. Nothing. The wind was still. The trees weren't even swaying. My heart was pounding in my chest. I convinced myself I was just imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But the next few nights, the tapping returned. And this time, it wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention from below. One night, around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the door of the tower, and stepped outside. The air was thick, and the ground was damp with dew. I crept down the stairs of the tower, my pulse quickening with each step. At the base, the night seemed to press in around me. The fog had rolled in, thick and swirling, making everything feel closer, suffocating. There was no sound except for the low murmur of the wind and the distant calls of animals in the forest. And then I saw it, a shape, something tall and thin, standing just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, but the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, almost unnaturally so. It was dark, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden by the hood of a tattered cloak. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze in place, watching it. Something about it felt wrong. There was an unnatural stillness, as if it wasn't quite human. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned and moved deeper into the trees, its movements slow and deliberate. I knew I should have gone back up to the tower, but something compelled me to follow. I was scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see what it was. I moved cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the fog, but the figure was always just out of reach, moving ahead of me like it knew where I was. After what felt like hours of chasing this thing through the trees, I finally stopped to catch my breath. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural voice, almost a growl, whispering from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I couldn't see the figure, but I could feel it watching me, just out of sight. "Why?" I whispered back, my voice shaky. "What do you want?" The voice laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It sounded ancient, full of bitterness and malice. "This place has been waiting for someone like you." I turned, ready to run, but the fog had thickened. I couldn't see anything but the swirling mist around me. I felt a cold hand grip my arm, icy and clammy. I screamed, but the hand tightened its hold. I jerked away and spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the fog, the trees, and the silence. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, my heart racing. I ran toward the tower as fast as I could, not daring to look back. By the time I made it up the stairs and locked the door, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I huddled in the corner of the tower, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I hadn't seen the figure clearly, but I could still feel its presence lingering in the air. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep at all, and when dawn finally broke, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the morning light had washed away the terror of the night before. But it didn't go away. Over the next few days, the figure returned. It was always there, just at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You can't leave. This place is yours now." I tried to leave. I packed my bags, got ready to head down the mountain. But when I reached the road, I found that it had disappeared. The trail, the path, they were gone. The fog had come in, thick and oppressive, and the landscape had changed. I walked for hours, trying to find my way out, but no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the tower. It was like the forest itself had become a maze, trapping me inside. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't going anywhere. The place had claimed me. Days turned into weeks. I lost track of time. The figure was always there, always watching, always whispering, "You belong here." I knew then that I was never going to escape. The forest had taken me, and the spirits that lived there would never let me go. I don't know what happened to the others who came before me. I don't know if they saw the figure or heard the whispers. But I know this. If you ever find yourself alone in a fire lookout tower, far from civilization with the fog closing in around you, don't listen to the tapping. Don't follow the figure in the trees, because once you do, you might never leave. Feeling spooked? Subscribe for more terrifying tales that will send chills down your spine.
Next story.
I've been working as a fire lookout for almost 2 months now, and I'm starting to regret ever taking the job. Don't get me wrong, the job itself isn't bad. It's simple, and the pay is decent. The isolation, though, that's another story. I thought I'd enjoy the peace and quiet away from the noise of city life. But the more I stay in this tower, the more I realize I'm not just alone up here. It started on the 5th night. The weather had been strange for weeks. A thick fog that never seemed to lift. It rolled in every night, covering the entire forest in a dense shroud. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, even during the day. But the night was the worst. The sounds of the forest were different. The wind would howl through the trees, but there was something off about it, like it was trying to speak to me. That night, I sat by the window, sipping my coffee, when I first heard it. A voice. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't the wind. It was clear and distinct, coming from outside the tower. I rushed to the window, but the fog was thick, the forest swallowed in darkness. I couldn't see anything. No animals, no movement, nothing. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was a whisper, a woman's voice calling my name. "James. James." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to open the door and step outside, but something told me not to. The voice wasn't right. It sounded distant, as if it came from somewhere deep in the forest, yet it was too close, too intimate. It wasn't a voice I recognized. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window, my flashlight at the ready, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the fog and the trees, stretching on endlessly. The next morning, I thought I had imagined the whole thing, but when I went outside to check the perimeter of the tower, I found something strange. There, just at the edge of the clearing, were footprints. Barefoot prints, clearly left in the mud, leading toward the tower. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Who would be out here? No one else was supposed to be up in the mountains. The only people who came by were the occasional ranger or maintenance worker, and they never ventured this far out, but these prints were fresh, and they were heading straight toward the tower. I checked the door, but it was still locked. The windows were sealed. No one had gotten inside. Still, the footprints were there. As I followed them, they seemed to circle the tower, but then they just stopped, as if the person had vanished into thin air. The whispers didn't stop after that. They grew louder, more persistent. At night, they would call my name again, always from the forest, always in that same eerie tone. Sometimes I would hear them during the day too, when the fog was thick, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The worst part was when I would hear footsteps at night, just outside the tower. Soft, slow steps, almost like someone was walking in the fog, just beyond my reach. I would press my ear to the window, straining to hear, but I never saw anyone. I tried calling the ranger station, but the radio was always silent. No one ever responded. Days turned into weeks, and the isolation started to wear on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, one night, everything changed. It was around midnight, and I was in the tower, pacing back and forth, trying to ignore the voice that was still whispering my name. Suddenly, I heard something different. A loud bang. It came from below, like something heavy had hit the tower's base. I rushed to the window and shone the flashlight down, but I couldn't see anything. The fog was thicker than ever, the air too heavy to see through. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The air was damp, cold, and thick with fog. I could barely see the ground beneath me, but I could hear the footsteps again. The same soft, deliberate steps echoing in the fog, but this time they were closer than they'd ever been before. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, but the footsteps continued. I took a hesitant step forward, but then the voice came again, louder this time, a sharp, shrill whisper. "James." I turned, and for the first time I saw her. She was standing in the fog, barely visible, her long hair hanging in front of her face. She wore a tattered dress, the fabric shredded and stained. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black, voids of darkness that seemed to swallow everything around her. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was just standing there, staring at me with those empty eyes. "James, come closer," she whispered. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I turned and ran back to the tower, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I didn't know who she was or what she wanted, but I knew I wasn't supposed to get any closer. The whispers didn't stop after that. In fact, they only grew more insistent, more frantic, each night bringing new calls. Sometimes I'd hear them in the day as well, echoing through the fog like they were right behind me. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. I was on the edge, barely holding on. I thought about leaving, but every time I tried to find a way down, the path would change. The fog would roll in, and I'd end up back at the tower. I was stuck, trapped in that tower with her. One night, the whispers stopped. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But when I looked out the window, I saw her again, standing in the fog, staring up at me. This time, she wasn't alone. There were others with her, shadows in the mist, indistinct but unmistakable, figures moving toward me slowly, relentlessly, and I realized, too late, that I wasn't alone up here. Not at all. The last thing I remember was her voice, clear as day, right outside the door. "You'll never leave."